Yearly 2026 Hypothetical Hurricane Season made on Scratch yearly, as I still am focusing on Greenville, but I will be doing some tracks on Colder Severe Weather Center, of course. And this is my yearly hypothetical, and see if I get it right. And let's get into the animation. And in summary, Gonzalo hit Houston with winds of 175 miles per hour, was the strongest storm and the costliest storm. Gonzalo did $100 billion in damage, and it changed the way Galveston and Houston would be forever. Until then, goodbye.